I think we've all realized through the course of our lives that much is revealed about us during times of crisis. And I think that's certainly been the case during this COVID-19 dilemma that we've all faced for so long. Now, the book of Daniel that we've just been reading from, the book of Daniel opens with a crisis. It's a crisis both on a national scale, but also in the personal, individual lives of God's people. Now, God's people they'd been living in Judah, living there for generations. This was the promised land that God had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, their forefathers. And they'd been living there just as God had promised. Now, when we pick up the story of Daniel, it's the end of the 7th century before Christ. It's probably 605 BC. So this isn't a storybook story. This is history, and we need to remember that. According to verse 1 of chapter 1, we're in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. But all is not well, because we're told that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, Babylon was a huge nation. It was the mightiest nation in that whole region, much, much greater than tiny little Judah. But in a sense, there was no need to panic. God's people had been attacked by powerful enemies in the past. Many times that had happened. And God had always defended them and had always brought victory. But not this time. No, through the prophets, God had warned again and again what would happen if they continued ignoring him and disobeying his laws. And now the Lord keeps his word. And in verse 2 we're told that he delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And the king and many of the people were taken to Babylon, taken there as exiles. And the temple where God had dwelled among his people, it was destroyed. The temple had been there, very much the symbol of God's presence with them. And so its destruction is significant. And those temple treasures, they were taken to the land of Shinar and put in the house of Nebuchadnezzar's god instead, this false god or pagan god. Now, as I was telling you last Sunday, this series is based on the Bible, of course, but we're also following a book by Alastair Begg called Brave by Faith. And Alastair, he rightly says that this was the greatest crisis in the history of God's people since Adam and Eve were thrown out of the garden. It looked like to the surrounding nations, it looked like the gods of Babylon were stronger than the God of the Bible. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had shown his strength many times in the past by protecting his people. So how had the Babylonians defeated them so thoroughly? Those people, God's people, must have wondered, where is our God when we need him? I'm sure the people of Judah, in the midst of the turmoil where they found themselves, I'm sure they probably forgot their continual disobedience and about God's repeated warnings. Instead, I imagine that they simply felt confused, especially as their kids, their young people were carted off to Babylon. They probably wondered, what is God playing at? Why is he allowing this? We're God's people. This isn't supposed to happen. Now, verse 2 mentions the land of Shinar. That was the region where Babylon was located. Now, that probably means very little to us, but for those Jewish people, they would have remembered Genesis chapter 11. They would have remembered that Shinar was where the Tower of Babel was built. It's the place where mankind had gathered to oppose God's plan for the human race. God had said, go out and spread across the whole world and multiply. But the people at that time, they said, no, let's stay together, let's gather, and let's make a name for ourselves by building a great tower that reaches to the sky. In other words, they had rebelled against God in their disobedience. And this was the land that those young people were taken to. I'm sure their parents must have wondered, how would they survive? And if they survived physically, what chance did they have of remaining in their Jewish faith, the faith of their parents? Now, I suspect that in some ways, this is increasingly how Christian parents feel today. The land our children are growing up in, and more specifically, the culture that they're growing up in, can at times cause us to fear, especially to fear for the spiritual safety of the young people in our care. We can find ourselves asking, why, oh God, why do we have to live in such a godless society? Why do we have to live in it? And why do our kids have to grow up in the midst of all this ungodliness? Now, the book of Daniel helps to answer those questions. We'll see that very clearly as the weeks move forward. Because the book of Daniel tells us what happened to God's people living in Babylon, a wicked pagan nation. And we're told the happenings of God's people, specifically through the accounts of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So as Alastair Begg says, when our society feels more and more like Babylon than Jerusalem, this account of Daniel and his three friends shows us that we can live with courage and we can live with confidence in God despite what's happening in the world all around us. Here in Daniel chapter 1, we read that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he commanded one of his officials, Aspenaz, to bring the best looking and the cleverest of the young Jewish men, bring them to the palace and educate them in the ways of Babylon so that they can serve the king. Basically to remove any trace of their old Jewish worldview and reprogram them to serve in Babylon. Now today, whenever young people head off to university, away from the Christian influence of family and home church, they can face enormous pressure to leave behind them the faith that they were brought up with. But it was even worse for those young people, those young Israelites in Babylon, because they were faced with a deliberate scheme to change them. Already they were in a new land. They were immersed in Babylonian culture. And now we're told that they were to be trained for 3 years in the Babylonian language and in the literature and writings of that region. All ways that were intended to indoctrinate them into the Babylonian way of thinking. You see, what we read and what we're taught changes the way we think. And that changes who we are. Which is why, unsurprisingly, it's why teaching and training young people and children is so very important. Not just with knowledge, but I would say perhaps even more importantly, with character and behaviour. It's not surprising then whenever we're introduced to Daniel and his three friends, the first thing we're told about is how they're given new names. You see, their old names honoured the God of the Bible. Those old names honoured the Lord. But their new names were chosen to praise the pagan gods of Babylon instead. Now think about how important your name is to you. Think about how important it is to your sense of self. And so by giving Daniel and his three friends, giving them new names, giving them Babylonian names, this was a very definite effort to change their identity. Now, realistically, they had to go along with these changes. They'd been located, they had been renamed, and they were being re-educated. They had to go along with those things if they simply wanted to stay alive. Now, another aspect of the king's programme, another aspect involved changing what they ate and drank. Basically, there weren't to be no links with their old lives in Judah. None of those links must be allowed to remain. But to this, Daniel and his 3 friends say no. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now, they couldn't, I've said already, they couldn't prevent themselves being taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. They couldn't prevent themselves being given new names or being forced to learn the language and literature of Babylon. But they could resist the food and drink from the king's table. And that's what they did. You see, God's Old Testament people had rules about what they ate and drank. Rules about diet, which distinguished them from the surrounding nations. As Alastair Begg points out, for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, this was the last thread tying them to their Jewish roots and their Jewish faith. Plus, in pagan nations like Babylon, the first portion of the food was offered up to the idols of the false gods. And the first portion of any drink was poured out on the altar of false gods. And so this was a line that they simply could not cross. But note carefully, note that they weren't being awkward or just simply being a nuisance. In fact, Daniel was well liked by the official in charge of them. And later on, they turn out to be the best of all those who were in training. They were bright, they were hard-working, and in other words, they were good students. Good students who weren't constantly being awkward. But they couldn't, and they wouldn't eat the king's food, even though that risked the king's anger, which generally resulted in execution. And therefore they were faced with a massive decision. And we need to realize that it wasn't a spur of the moment thing. No, this was the result of godly character and godly priorities developed before this challenge to their faith arose. The truth is, as we began thinking about it at the start, the truth is we see who people really are when we're under pressure. We see who we really are when we're faced with crisis or difficulty. And so Daniel and his 3 friends, they must have been tempted to simply give in and go along with the society all around them. But they didn't do that. And neither should we. Even when we face temptation, the temptation to simply keep our heads down and go with the flow, we mustn't give in to that temptation. No, if faith is alive, then we'll swim against the current if that's what it takes to obey our God. Only dead faith, like dead fish, will go with the current and choose to accept the ungodly aspects of society rather than to resist them. But let's get back to Daniel. Daniel tries to get the chief official to agree to a different diet, but that official refuses, which isn't surprising as his life was at risk too. But instead, Daniel doesn't give up. Instead, Daniel strikes a deal with the guard who was looking after them, that for 10 days they'll only eat vegetables and water, and then that guard can compare them with the others, those who were eating from the king's table. Now, we mustn't miss how courageous that was, Basically, Daniel was saying that we're going to obey God, even though there's a very real risk to our lives. And we trust God will come through for us. Now, the guard agreed to Daniel's plan. And after 10 days, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they all looked healthier than the other guys who were eating the king's food. So much so that the guard put all of them on vegetables and water for the rest of those 3 years. And I have to say, I'm not sure how those young men would have felt about that, but that's what happened. Now, that chief official who had first, he was the one who had refused Daniel's request. He knew nothing about what was going on under the guard's care. He knew nothing about this change that had taken place. Now, before we move on, as I hinted at with the kids, what we need to realize that this is not a passage giving us a diet that we should follow. Alastair Begg points out that this is not about superfoods, but about the supernatural. You see, it was God miraculously at work that caused these things to happen. The 4 lads who looked strong and healthy, that was because God made sure of it. And every day for 3 years, when they woke up and looked and felt fit and strong, that reminded them of God's power and God's protection. And how did those 4 men do it? How did they stand strong, even under such severe pressure? Well, the answer is because of what they knew about God. In verse 2 and verse 9 and verse 17 of this first chapter of Daniel, God's control is clearly seen. In verse 2, we're told that the Lord gave the king of Judah into the hands of the king of Babylon. In verse 9, we're told that it was God who gave Daniel favor in the eyes of the chief official. And then here in verse 17, that God gave our 4 young Israelites knowledge and understanding. It was God who gave it to them, and he gave Daniel the ability to interpret dreams. God was in control when Babylon defeated Jerusalem and defeated Judah. Yes, in the past, God had given Judah many blessings, including victories in battle. But when Babylon defeated them, it was all the Lord's doing. It was in judgment for continuing in sin, despite all of God's many, many warnings through the prophets. But God is not just in charge of the big stuff, like wars and global politics. He's also in control of the details of our individual lives too, just like we've seen with Daniel and his 3 friends. At the end of those 3 years, when the kings and the officials saw how exceptional they were, that king probably thought that his plan had worked. He was still under the illusion that they were eating his food and his drink. But what he didn't know was that it had all been God's doing all along. The Lord had been in control. He'd been with these 4 faithful young men. And the Lord had plans to use them, to use these guys in Babylon. So the lesson for us is to know our God, to really know him. He is the hero of today's passage, not Daniel. That's true for every passage that we turn to. God is the hero, not the other characters that we might meet. I have a great quotation I want to share with you. This is from Alastair Begg. You and I will only live brave like Daniel did if we first know the God who Daniel did. Daniel knew that the Lord was behind all that was happening. So he wasn't going to stop loving and trusting and obeying the Lord when life got tough. And the same is true today. God is still in control of all that happens. We live in a world that's increasingly like Babylon. As we heard here last Sunday, we live here as strangers and exiles. This world is not our home. Now, if we're Christian people, then God's kingdom is our home. Today we are in Babylon, but God is in control even here. We face all the challenges of secularism. There are constant pressures to go along with our culture rather than to obey our God. And in the midst of those pressures, in fact, before you next face those pressures, we need to realize where our true home really is and to whom our hearts belong. We all need to do that. We all need to think through where we will draw the lines that we're not willing to cross. Do that in advance. That was the heading for today's sermon. Today's title was Know Your Lines. Know where you need to draw the line when it comes to the various anti-biblical agendas we face in today's world. Issues like gender identity, gay marriage, and so on. You can probably think of countless others too. Think carefully and prayerfully about what lines you're not willing to cross. Lines that you can't cross if you're a Christian and if you follow the Lord Jesus instead of this world. This is so important, so very important. So know your lines. And even more importantly, know the God who will give you all that you need in every situation, all that you need to stand firm for him. That's what we're going to pray just now. So let's bow. Let's pray.